What would it be like if instead of being born in your family, in your linguistic context, you were born in the exact same socioeconomic environment, but speaking a different language? No, instead of English, Spanish, instead of Spanish, Armenian, instead of Armenian, Korean, Italian, Japanese. Would you be different if you were born speaking a different language? Would the world appear different to you? Would that change the way in which you think? Or how about somebody who acquired language and then lost language because of some brain injury that maybe made them aphasic and unable to understand and process language? What would the thoughts of someone like that be like? Even more extreme, imagine someone who were raised with no language at all. What if they never acquired language? What would it be like to be such a person? How different would that person be from somebody who did acquire language? Could you still interact with the world and respond flexibly and adapt to your environment just the same? Could you reminisce about the past and plan your future? Would you be able to appreciate art and music and understand the appearance of periodic balls of fire in the sky that come and go every so often? Could you wonder about where the sun goes at night and the beauty of a sunset? And is there life after death or life on other planets? Could you do all of these things if you did not have language? And to the question about what is the relationship between language and our thought and who we are and how we think and how we understand the world is a very profound question that has been asked for a very long time. And there's a number of reasons why this is a very relevant question. For one, if you ask people, overwhelmingly, a large part of our thought feels linguistic. It feels like we use words to think very often. And if you ask people, they will report that a significant amount of their thoughts feels to them as taking place embedded and couched in language. It makes sense to think that our thought is probably linguistic. Now, a second reason for asking this is that in a sense, we certainly are a very unique species. The way in which we manipulate the environment, the kind of things that as a species we have achieved are certainly unmatched by any other species that we know. So in this respect, we certainly are very unique. Now, a second aspect of us that is extremely unique, as we've discussed last week, is the fact that we possess language. So of course, there is an intuitive question of whether possessing language contributes, and if it does, to what extent, to our being unique. And in the sense, we already discussed again last week how Deschartres had realized that what made us so different from the so-called beast machines was how creative we are. And language is a beautiful example of the creativity of the human mind. Now, in addition, there is also an intriguing correlation between the development of language and the development of certain cognitive skills. And of course, it's difficult to tease apart which is causing which. So is it that in order for our mind and our cognitive skills to develop, we need to acquire some aspect of language, or vice versa? Is it that as our mind and our cognitive capabilities increase, we acquire certain skills in language? But certainly it almost seems like these two things through development are sometimes progressing together, hand in hand. And so it makes sense to wonder whether the two are influencing each other one way or the other. And finally, it is worth noting that, that some aspects of thought and language certainly share certain features. You might remember we discussed last week structure dependence and the fact that if you have some tokens, some words, the order in which you place them and you thread them determines whether the order is acceptable and determines the meaning. For example, if you take the three tokens, cat, dog, and chase, the order in which you thread them allows you to say completely different, to convey completely different meanings, whether it's a dog chasing a cat or a cat chasing a dog. And now the same is true of other aspects of thought. One example would be arithmetic and arithmetic cognition. Think about taking the three tokens 4, 3, and minus. If we say 4 minus 3 or 3 minus 4, the meaning of it is very different. So it makes sense, given that there are deep similarities between how our mind works and how language seems to work. It makes sense to wonder if you need one in order to develop the other. So does language affect thought? Well, trivially, the answer is, of course, that's what language is for. Right now, me speaking to you, the contents of what I'm saying are an exercise in affecting your thought. Anytime you've heard a politician speak, that was an exercise in them trying to affect your thought. Every time you talk to a friend and you share an experience, or they share an experience, that is an exercise in affecting what somebody is thinking. So the question is not whether language can affect thought. That's what language is for. The contents of what we say are meant to affect somebody else's thought. The question is whether language shapes thought in some way other than by the semantic content it conveys, meaning in some way other than through the message, than through what is being said. Does the structure of language itself, its syntactic aspect, its lexicon, does that affect the way in which we think? And of course, there are two polar extreme ends of this discussion. On the one hand, the view that language is really just communicative in nature. So language doesn't affect thought. Language is separate from thought. All that language is, under this view, is a conduit for thought. So I can have some thoughts which are non-linguistic in nature. I can turn them into a linguistic code. I can speak that code and give it to you. You can receive that and turn that message into a mental representation. So language is really just a conduit to convey thoughts from one mind to another. Now, at the polar opposite end of the spectrum is the view that language is cognitive in nature. Language and thought are inextricably linked one another, and you cannot divide them. So in this sense, language can have a profound effect on thought. And some of the ways in which this has been studied is by comparing languages that do have certain words and that express a certain concept versus languages that do not. Does that affect the way in which you think about the world or the way in which you interface or understand the world? On the other hand, it could also be that just having a language versus not having a language might affect the way in which you can think. Now, the second way of understanding language as cognitive, language as being key thought, is the so-called, the view that language is not constitutive of thought, which was the view we just saw, but rather that language is necessary for thought. And see, this is a complex idea. It's difficult to evaluate, because I could really say that, in the sense, your blood and your vascular system is necessary for thought. And so is oxygen. Without oxygen, without a vascular system, there'd be no thought. Right? So, but of course, you would not say, well, what role does the vascular system play on thought? Right? I mean, the vascular system allows you to have thought. Right? Without it, you could not have any thought. But it'd be strange to ask, how does oxygen influence your thought, other than allowing you to have well-formed thoughts? So for this reason, this type of proposition is a little harder to evaluate. It's a very interesting one, but it's a little harder to evaluate. So for the rest of this topic, we will really be concerned with addressing the question of whether language serves a communicative function or whether language is cognitive in nature. And by cognitive, I really mean constitutive of thought.